This episode of Chains is sponsored exclusively by Charlie Foxtrot Brewing. Ask about beers from this veteran-owned brewery in tap rooms across Southwest Florida and Western North Carolina. Thank you for supporting our veterans. Chains, Part 26. Written by Dustin Dhonash, narrated by Bernard Baruch Carmen. Something had been off at Penelope Farm for a while. The first sign was when I stopped by the local diner. I saw our neighbor, Martha, in the mauvest possible outfit, talking to Sheriff Ramsey about the strange smell that had been cropping up regularly. Martha would always wear something mauve to offset her social anxiety. In fact, the more anxious she was, the more of that annoying color she'd have on her. Don't get me wrong, she and her husband Stephen were great neighbors, and we had grown to be friends over the years. Our weekly dinners were a big part of that, even if the past month's meetings amounted to complaining about the smell of the woods and what the people at Penelope Farm had been doing. She wanted to blame them at every step, but I wasn't so sure. Things had been pretty hard on Corey and Argolia Penelope. They were already in their 60s and either hadn't had time to adapt to a changing world because of their lifestyle, or they were content with letting things pass them by. The Penelopes, as I've been told, were raised by their grandmother, who went by Big Ma because of her height, though her real name was Hera Scher. She was a tobacco farmer and they were raised as such. It was a hard life, but they did well, despite surviving mostly on government subsidies. After their grandmother passed, they got several offers on their land from various developers. A lot of us did around that time. My parents ended up selling a large portion off to some kind of dental company, keeping the rest for our family. I remember my dad saying, "It was a very difficult but smart decision." The Penelopes, however, didn't sell. The next decade or so became even more difficult as federal payments for tobacco stopped, and they were all but forced to convert to an apple farm. It was a steady decline from there, most of which I had witnessed as I grew up. I even worked on the farm a few times at the insistence of my mother, who wanted me to know what the old life was like. My experiences made me glad that my parents sold our way out of that old life. Knowing all of that, it was hard to blame the Penelopes for anything, let alone for something that might harm the land. The fact that Martha was with the sheriff, though, meant that things were going to come to a head over all this. I knew that, as of recently, things were going particularly badly for the Penelopes. They seemed to have a slew of delinquents coming and going from the farm, and I hadn't seen Corey out much this season. Some of the fields had even gone to waste. I was starting to get concerned. The recent cold snap definitely wasn't going to make things better either. I left the diner that day with a feeling of dread that I just couldn't shake. I was pleasantly surprised that my business trip was cut short, and I got back to town later that week, in time for our standing dinner plans. I walked over, dinner roast in hand, and rang the doorbell. Several attempts later, there was no answer. I snooped a bit, looking in the high, thin windows of their garage. Both of their cars were there. And after a moment of letting my thoughts run wild about how they might be imprisoned in some underground cell awaiting cruel punishment at the hands of some crazed murderers, I gathered myself and figured they had just gone into the woods on a walk as they often do. I knew where they'd be and thought I might go meet them, but visions of bears following the scent of my freshly cooked roast and with no place to store the feast, I thought the better of it. I got back home and rang them a few times, but there was no answer. Left to my own devices and feeling some bothersome combination of worried and inconvenienced, I ate the roast by myself and promptly dozed off. I was startled awake as the low hiss of the dead radio channel on my father's old wooden tabletop leaped suddenly into the intro of the new pirate radio show, Relaxin' Randy's Radio Rodeo. A friend of mine had gotten me into it, but it came on at random times and I'd missed the last few. This time I had left the radio on with the volume up in the hope that I'd hear it. Unfortunately, I had fallen asleep just a few feet from it, and the shock of the program starting almost gave me a heart attack. I quickly adjusted the volume and thought briefly about all the money I could save on coffee if I woke up like that more often. After a hilarious skit about the benefits of milk and bread, I was shocked to hear that not only was Penelope Farm on fire, but that the sheriff that Martha was speaking to, William Ramsey, had been missing. The feeling of dread that had been lurking since that moment in the diner surged back in full force. As I began to piece the situation together, the missing sheriff, the missing neighbors, the fire, the terrible condition of the woods, the delinquents that seemed to overtake the farm, my stomach sank. The idea that I should have checked on the Penelope sooner given those circumstances knocked me even lower. I looked out the window to see a faint red glow in the direction of the farm and decided immediately to go over and give whatever help I could. As soon as I opened the door, a cold wind whipped through the house. In that moment, I decided it would be best to be prepared. In addition to the ski jacket, waterproof pants, and heavy boots, I readied and packed my pistol, a Beretta 92. Better be safe than sorry, I said aloud to myself. I plodded along, following the old trail that led from our land to theirs. The snow was actually starting to accumulate. I was about halfway there when suddenly I heard several gunshots in the direction of the farm. I froze in place, remembering the radio broadcast that said the mountain wasn't accessible because of the conditions. I wasn't the type to go looking for danger, but the bad feelings I had about the situation, combined with the idea that someone was at the farm with a gun and that no help could get there, well, that meant I was the help. I made the decision to go back and grab something with some more stopping power. I prayed that I wouldn't have to use it or the pistol, but as I prepped the shotgun, I heard another round pop in the direction of the farm that made my heart sink. It was pitch dark as I hustled back down the path, so I flipped on the small light mounted on the shotgun. The fiery glow coming from the Penelope land was much weaker, though I had trouble taking that as a sign for the better. Suddenly, from the east, I heard someone yelling. I paused for a second, turning the light back off briefly. Against the distant streetlight down the hill, I could just barely see the outline of someone running in this direction, followed by several others with some kind of long sticks. They were catching up. I moved over to the fence line to get a better view. Just then, the larger group caught up and started bashing the lone man with the sticks. I figured this was as good of a time as any to intervene. I walked over to them in the darkness and slipped through the hole in the fence that had been there for some years. I got pretty close to them, across the concrete pad of the former dental facility, and then turned the mounted flashlight back on. I could see some of the newer farm boys, the delinquents, mercilessly beating the poor man who was on the ground. I gave them a few words of warning, which they challenged immediately. I didn't even seem to startle them. A few more steps would put me in close range. I was still hesitant to shoot. One of them smacked the fallen man in the head so hard that his skin split open. The small splatter of blood flew out of range of the light. That was the last straw for me. I racked the shotgun and ordered them to stop at the top of my lungs. Two of the three made a run for it, which was fine by me, but the other just paused and looked up at me with a crazed grin. I'll never forget the look. There was something about the way the light reflected in his eyes that made him seem non-human. Then, and without breaking eye contact with me, he began to smack the downed man harder and harder. Finally, I had to pull the trigger. The impact knocked him a couple of feet away. I ran over to check the man they were beating. With my pocket light, I couldn't find anything too serious, the one exception being the split from the one that connected with his head, which he seemed to shrug off. As he checked on the man who attacked him, he grimly shook his head. He took a moment and then introduced himself as Les Ramsey. He explained that he was a deputy out here looking for his uncle, who was also a sheriff. My absolute worst fears were confirmed when he told me the situation at the farm included a cult, a crazed man with a rebar-wrapped leg, and some particularly awful-sounding chanting. After telling him I was there to help and loaning him my sidearm, we began to make a plan. But the wind and the cold up here on the flat open surface of the old building made it impossible to hear each other. So we moved down the hill, closer to the farm. We made our way down the hill through the brush, halfway to the tree line near a small corrugated pipe. During our brief discussion on the way, I learned more of the terrible details of what had happened and was stunned to find that Argolia was firing weapons wildly around the farm. I asked about Corey, Argolia's brother, Martha, my mauve-loving neighbor, and her husband, Stephen, but he didn't know anything about them. As soon as we got situated, I caught sight of the man with the rebar-encased leg laying in a divot in the yard, holding his head. He was a terrible sight, burned and wounded with an eerie dark blue stain around his mouth and face. On top of all that, he had the gun tucked into his leg brace. We made a break for him immediately, covering some 80 feet, again through the clingy brush and down the hill. The danger of the situation was creeping in. He could get up at any point. We got about 20 feet from him and Les said, "We know you have the gun. Throw it here now." At that point, the man began to get to his feet, mumbling something about who had the gun. Les gave me the signal to hold as I raised the shotgun at him. He shouted again at the man to drop his gun. As the mangled man stood up, I could see his hand move down the revolver tucked into the metal contraption on his leg. I fired a warning shot into the air, but the man just laughed and drew it from his brace. Once again, I had no choice. I took aim and fired a shot at the man. He was down.